If you want to learn more about what it is that Congressman Tim Murphy was able to get through the House of Representatives in the form of his mental health, Families in Mental Health Crisis Act, certainly go to his website. There's a lot of information there. He's joining us for another 2 segments. Later we'll have Audra Gusky. In the meantime, let's get to a couple of things here. I'm looking at what some of the pushback seems to be. At least something I saw in North Carolina indicated that it's a step backwards, your bill, because the emphasis in recent years has been more about recovery oriented. Now, I have a feeling where we're headed with this, because you touched on this in the first part of our discussion, that relies really on a focus of the sovereignty of that person who's ill. Your point is that in some cases they're not capable of being able to do that, and in a lot of cases engaging family members in that process by sharing information will be more helpful than relying only on a person who, for whatever number of reasons, is incapable of doing it by himself or herself.
Yeah, the thought that you leave it all up to the person to make the decision is one of the most perverse and corrupt thoughts that we could have put upon the mentally ill. Someone said this once, and I could see how this works. We will look back on the 20th century with the mentally ill, that the crimes we as a society perpetrated upon them will be seen with the equality of disgust as what we did to slaves in the 1800s. And let me describe that. What began in the 1800s said, let's take the mentally ill, and instead of putting them in jail, we'll put them in nice hospitals and happy places and relax. Those became packed in the 1900s. And in World War II, we had 550,000 hospital beds, and people were chained to walls and straitjacketed and put in ice and given lobotomies radically. We tortured people. They were killed. It was awful. It was awful how we degraded people. But what still came out of that is this movement of some states saying, let's save money by closing them down, and other people saying, let's get them out of there because they're in there against their will. I get that. We should not be doing that wrongly. But we moved that pendulum so far to say nobody should ever be in anywhere against their will. There's people who believe that. And where I see that's a perversion of thought is it's based on this assumption that that person has no more right to be anything else than what they are. And that the right to be sick is more important than the right to be well. And also evades all scientific reason to completely disavow the facts. So you alluded before, it was in the Post-Gazette today, about a young boy with depression. And the parents in that article talk about, well, he was depressed, and we say our son's depressed, and the parents are saying, oh, what's wrong with you as parents? Everyone wants to run from them. And so for so long, we just blame depression on other things and say, well, the depressed person, let him pull himself up at the bootstraps, maybe he'll get over it. If he doesn't want help, he doesn't want help. And then they find out it's a metabolic disorder. And by giving this person some other medicines, it makes a world of difference. It's not suicidal. He's involved in life. And now, wait a minute. What did we do to that person before by writing them off? And that's the perversion of the stigma. We push it on someone.
2 things. Take me back to the slavery parallel again.
Well, it's just that what we did there was we treated people as inhuman, and we abused them. And what we do with mental illness in the 20th century, we treated them as inhuman. We assumed they couldn't do anything, so we locked them up. I mean, the old asylums in the world for the longest time, they chained people to the walls. They tortured them. They whipped them. They beat them. They were taken into surgery. I mean,
so there's a moral equivalent.
The moral equivalent of the hideous way we treat a human being is to not see them as human at all. And that's what we did in both cases. An awful thing.
Let's talk a little bit about something else that comes with this, and that is the quote-unquote stigma, which, I'm very passionate about myself, as it relates to your efforts, and they go back some period of time on a personal end for you, but it also is a response to the gun violence and many of the factors you described in the numbers earlier, and maybe how to combat that. But at a more fundamental or grassroots standpoint, the idea of somebody saying that they have a mental health issue that is not in the realm of what we're talking about, in some ways is a very important hurdle that needs to be addressed.
Sure.
In my thought, I mean, again, I understand it's outside the scope of legislation, but this quote-unquote stigma is idiocy to me.
Sure.
If you have an ankle injury, you go to the ankle doctor.
Exactly.
If you have a problem with the oil in your truck, you go take the truck to get the oil. Everybody does that routinely, but the moment you say, guys, you know, there's something there going on from a mental health standpoint that isn't about severe, but nonetheless is within that realm, people back off.
We do, and we have this fear that's been going on for centuries. We want to lock them up. We want to force them, get them away. I believe that treatment before tragedy can make a big difference. When you look at the population, the Allegheny County Jail, Washington County Jail, Westmoreland, pick the county jail, those are the biggest mental institutions in our country, the county and city jails. But you're far unlikely to get treatment, and you're 10 times more likely to be in a jail than a hospital if you're mentally ill. And 80% of those people get no treatment at all. In fact, they're more likely to be abused there. And yet, it's 20 times more expensive to put someone in jail than outpatient care. What are we doing as a society with that? And our bill does have turnaround for a lot of those things, making sure treatment alternatives are there for the person who's in the revolving door of prison, making sure there's more providers, help judges learn more what they can do, specific training for police officers when they encounter someone who's mentally ill. But the thing about this is, I want to make sure we say it, people can get well. That new treatments that weren't around 20 or 30 years ago, whether it's medications or types of psychotherapeutic approaches there. You know, a famous story in Pittsburgh, you love sports, Ellis, I mean, you're famous for your knowledge of sports. Mike Webster. What did people think? Bless his soul, Mike Webster. They thought he was a homeless guy on drugs, terrible, right? All these things. And what did we find out? He had bad concussions that were leading him to be that way. And for the longest time, nobody wanted to talk to him. Maybe people helped him out. They took pity on him. A number of other Steelers said that. Now, granted, that's a head injury, but the analogy still holds. Once we found out what it was, we stopped blaming him and said, maybe we can deal with this.
Exactly. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Senate version. Now, what needs to happen for your version and that version to come together?
Okay, well, this is a little...
And by the way, I should point out, and let me just say this to the camera, if you've not checked out what this man's been doing on a relentless basis to move this forward to conclusion, you need to simply Google the man's name. You've been everywhere with this, and obviously after several years, 4 years I think, that you've put into this, you're really staying as focused as you can. But talk for a moment about what needs to be done to reconcile with the Senate version of this.
Yeah, so this is how a bill becomes law, you know. So we moved it through the House after 4 years of delays for lots of reasons. Now it's in the hands of the Senate. The month of September, we are in session, and then in October, we're not in session until after the election. So what has to happen is the Senate has to either do their version or the House version. There is a Senate version that Congressman Lamar Alexander is the lead man on. It has some of the top lines of ours in, less reform in there, but my hope is the first week they're back, pass it and send it over with a resolution and go to conference. Now the problems are this. If some members decide to put gun amendments on there or other issues, Republicans or Democrats, whether it's going to be a big pile on, and then the bill will get in lockdown. It just isn't going to go. Remember, any senator can say no to any bill and say we're going to put a hold on it. If that's the case, the bill goes nowhere, and then you've reached the point where you have. I mean, what do you do? I mean, they could still call it the House version, but then will something happen after the election? But then you have the issue too is we're hearing that some people say, let's let the Senate do absolutely nothing so that they can campaign, so one side can campaign and say, see, a Republican Senate run Senate is totally immobile, not doing anything. That's the theme talk about. But everybody, the Republicans and Democrats, want to vote on this. So I'm hoping they don't get mired down in those threats, slowing it down. We hope they do move forward. But boy, if they do, I go back to that number of the 350,000 people who are dying every year.
Let's assume two things. Let's assume that some issues are not going to get voted on, get the hairy eyeball, so to speak, before an election. Let's just assume that. Let's also assume that nobody's legislation is pristine, despite the fact that 422-2 would seem to reflect it's pretty well regarded. It's not good enough for the Senate to be, I mean, isn't this one of those issues that with the level of support that was in the House chamber, and in light of the fact that this is an issue that most people, including lawmakers, recognize, including the Senate, as something that needs attention. Why doesn't this get the push before the election, as opposed to more toxic or difficult or turn-off type of topics that you know is going to have pushback at the voter level?
I think that the embarrassment will be if going into the election, people see we didn't do this. When we talk about over 900 people dying a day, I mean, think about this. If we filled Heinz Field, the Peterson Arena, Consol Energy Center and PNC Park, and all those people died, and then filled them again, and those people